All right, diving in today, getting into some really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Looking at Christianity and Islam, but not in the usual way.
Right.
And we've got a unique guide for this one.
Yeah.
Frithjof Schuon,
Mm.
through his book, Christianity, Islam, Perspectives on Esoteric Ecumenism.
Yes.
So instead of the, typical kind of head-to-head, are they the same, are they different?
Mm-hmm.
Schuon takes a totally different approach to how these two faiths actually relate.
Right. And I think for our listener, who wants to get to the heart of the matter, the essence of the topic, without having to wade through tons and tons of material, that's what we aim to do in these deep dives.
Yeah, cut to the chase. Tell you what really matters.
That's right.
So our mission today is to kind of get into some of Schuon's core ideas about what connects these two faiths, Christianity and Islam, what separates them, and whether there's, some deeper underlying unity, or perhaps a fundamental difference in their approach.
Right.
And of course, we'll be looking at all this through the lens of Schuon.
Of course.
And we're also going to be looking at his ideas about how religious practices develop. And also his perspective on, this huge event, the Protestant Reformation.
And, the material touches on all sorts of things, from liturgical languages, like why certain languages are used in worship, to the very essence of faith and love. And don't worry, we're going to keep things very clear and structured so that you can understand all these complex ideas without feeling like you're drowning.
Right. It's a deep dive.
Yeah.
But we're going to keep our heads above water.
That's right. That's right.
So, first off, let's unpack this idea of how religious practices and languages develop and how they evolve over time.
Yeah, okay.
Schuon has this interesting take on this.
Yeah.
And he suggests that, when we see changes in how people worship, how they practice their religion, it's not just about things going downhill spiritually, which is often, a common worry.
Right. Things are getting worse and worse and worse, right?
Yeah. It's all falling apart.
Right.
But he says it's also a necessary process.
Yes.
Of almost like taking something infinite, something beyond human comprehension, and trying to crystallize it into forms and practices and rituals that humans can grasp and engage with. And that, over time, these forms naturally adapt and become more elaborated, more detailed.
Right.
So he sees this as a natural progression.
He does.
Not just a decline.
Not just decay.
Yeah. So he's saying there's a value in both, the original simple forms of worship.
Right.
You can imagine, a monk in a cave contemplating in solitude, as well as the more, elaborate rituals and symbolism and, that develop as a religion grows and faces new situations. So he's saying both of those have their place and purpose.
Right. And it's not just that. He even talks about liturgical languages.
Yeah, this is interesting. So for those who don't know, we're talking about things like Latin in Catholicism.
Right. Or classical Arabic in Islam.
Yeah, these languages that are used in the liturgy. And Schuon argues that these languages, they have a real objective value.
Yes.
It's not just about tradition for the sake of it. He believes that some languages become sacred, either because they were, the original languages of divine revelation.
Yeah, you'd think Hebrew?
Yeah, Hebrew or Arabic, or because they were, consciously adopted and dedicated to God.
Right, like Armenian or Old Slavonic.
Right. So they were set apart. For sacred use. And he says that they become imbued with a certain spiritual power.
Absolutely, certain sacredness.
Yeah. And so he's quite against this modern trend of ditching these traditional languages and replacing them with just everyday modern languages.
Yeah, the vernacular.
Yeah, in religious services.
Yeah, and it's not just about being resistant to change.
Right.
His point is that for the believers, there needs to be at least a basic respect and interest in these languages. Enough to learn the common prayers, to try to understand maybe not every single word, but at least some understanding, some respect.
Yeah, and he even goes so far as to say that, a faith that's too easy, that caters to, absolute unfamiliarity, it risks losing its depth, its real value.
Absolutely.
It requires a bit of effort, a bit of reaching.
Yeah, like you're saying,
Yeah.
if it's too easy, then what's the point?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on
Okay.
to a rather specific but really fascinating point.
Okay.
The enigma of the epiclesis.
Okay.
Now, for anyone who's scratching their head, this is about that moment in the Eucharist or Holy Communion where the Holy Spirit is invoked, to consecrate the bread and wine.
Right.
And this has been...
Bit of a sticking point.
Yeah, a bit of a sticking point.
Yeah.
Between different Christian traditions.
Absolutely.
The Orthodox tradition, they see this invocation as absolutely essential for the consecration to even occur.
Right.
On the other hand, you've got the Roman Catholic tradition.
Right.
And while they do have prayers invoking the Holy Spirit, it's not considered like the defining moment of consecration in their main liturgical canon.
Right. So it's interesting. There's this difference of emphasis.
Yeah, for sure. And Schuon offers this really interesting historical perspective here. He points out that, even in Western Christian rites that did have explicit epiclesis, in the past. Yeah. Some of the older French liturgies, Spanish liturgies.
Right, the Gallican Rite, the Mozarevic Rite.
Yeah. The historical understanding was that those prayers were more for the benefit of the people.
The people receiving communion.
Yeah, receiving communion. Yeah. Asking God to send the Spirit into their hearts. Rather than it being the moment. Yeah. That the bread and wine themselves became the body and blood.
Right. So it was more about the recipient.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating, he even questions the Orthodox view, that the epiclesis exists solely for, quote unquote, the active cooperation of the Eucharistic community. And he looks at, the actual words of these ancient prayers. And wonders, do they really emphasize this communal cooperation as their primary purpose?
Right.
Yeah. So it's making you really think about the nuances.
Yeah, the subtle nuances of these ancient texts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then he contrasts that with, the Catholic understanding, where the priest acts in persona Christian.
Right.
Literally, in the person of Christ. Yeah. When consecrating the elements.
Yeah, and the idea being that if Christ himself instituted this sacrifice and gave the words, then God wouldn't refuse it.
Right, wouldn't refuse a correctly performed ritual.
Right. It's a matter of divine institution.
Divine institution, that's right. Oh. And this leads to, I guess, a larger point. Yeah. About how different traditions define the church. For some in the Orthodox world, the church is often seen as existing wherever you have a bishop in communion with other Orthodox bishops, or even where the faithful are united in belief and practice.
Yeah, whereas the Catholic view has often been simplified to,
where the Pope is.
Where the Pope is, right. But Schuon, immediately adds this crucial detail to that view. Yeah. He emphasizes that the legitimacy of the Pope's authority rests on him being, a faithful interpreter and guardian of the traditional teachings.
The tradition,
of Western Christianity. Yeah. So he's not above tradition. He's meant to uphold it.
Yeah, he's meant to be a servant of the tradition.
Exactly. Yeah. And he even brings up how some, earlier popes and theologians believed that, Christ consecrated the elements simply by his initial blessing in the Gospels. Yeah. Before the words of institution. Before the specific words of consecration were even spoken. And this was a point of debate.
A point of debate, yeah.
That the Council of Trent never fully resolved.
Never fully resolved, yeah.
So it just shows that even within traditions, there's this...
historical complexity.
Yeah, historical complexity. Yeah. Okay, let's switch gears a bit now.
Okay.
And delve into Schuon's take on the Protestant Reformation. Right. This was a massive turning point in Western religious history. Yeah. And Schuon offers a really interesting way to look at it in relation to tradition. Okay. And he starts by pointing out something quite fundamental. Yeah. He says that Christ himself actually rejected certain established religious practices of his time, calling them, commandments of men rather than divine law.
Right. So already there's this idea of returning to the core of the teachings.
Yeah, stripping away.
Stripping away.
Later editions.
Right. And this was a central driving force behind reformers like John Wycliffe.
Yeah, and Jan Hus.
Jan Hus, yeah.
You know, centuries before Luther.
Yeah.
And Schuon doesn't shy away from acknowledging the problems that, you know, even the Eastern Orthodox Church saw in the Western papacy.
Yeah.
What they called papism.
Right, papism.
Which included, you know, the Pope acting not just as a spiritual leader, but as a secular ruler.
A temporal ruler, yeah.
Yeah.
With significant temporal power.
Right, even claiming authority above church councils and emperors.
Right, so there was this excess of power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That the Orthodox world had, you know, long criticized.
Right, and Schuon sees these excesses as contributing factors to the Reformation.
Right. So he sees them as, you know, legitimate grievances in a way.
To a degree, yeah.
But then he offers this somewhat paradoxical view of the papacy. He calls it problematical but inevitable.
Problematical but inevitable, yeah.
And he even suggests it served a providential purpose despite all of its ambiguities.
Yeah.
So, you know, he sees the complexities and even the, you know, the perceived imperfections as somehow fitting into, you know, the larger unfolding of history.
The grand scheme of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And then he gets into, you know, the motivations of Martin Luther himself, emphasizing his focus on a simpler, more inward faith.
Right.
And this, you know, resonated deeply with what Schuon calls the Germanic soul.
Germanic soul, yeah.
Which he sees as having, you know, this inclination towards inwardness.
Inwardness, yeah.
And a suspicion of overly complicated theology, rigid rituals, and the heavy hand of clerical authority.
Yeah, so this emphasis on individual conscience and inner experience.
Right. And Schuon also points to the influence of, you know, St. Augustine's ideas about the city of God and the earthly city on Luther.
Right.
And how, you know, observing what he saw as, you know, corruption within the Roman Church, Luther readily identified it with Augustine's earthly city.
Earthly city, yeah.
Focused on worldly power rather than spiritual purity.
Absolutely.
And it's quite ironic, you know, that while Luther was such a radical reformer in his time, Schuon believes he would probably be horrified by the liberalism seen in many modern Protestant denominations today.
Yeah, and he sees...
He wouldn't recognize it.
Yeah, he sees a more direct continuation of Luther's original emphasis on personal faith.
Yeah.
In movements like Pietism.
Right.
Often referred to as evangelical Protestantism.
Right. And in a kind of striking way of putting it, Schuon describes Luther as a German who was, in a sense, Semiticized by Christianity. And what he means by that is this, you know, deep valuing of inwardness and direct divine revelation.
Right, echoing that emphasis found in the Semitic religious traditions.
Yeah, like Judaism and Islam.
Right, in contrast to that more philosophical, Aristotelian-based scholasticism that had become prominent in medieval Western theology.
Right. So there's this tension between, you know, the interpersonal experience and the more...
The systematized theology?
Yeah, the more systematized approach. Okay, let's shift our focus now to Schuon's thoughts on these core theological concepts of faith, works, and love.
Okay.
This is another area where different religious traditions and even different interpretations within those traditions
absolutely
often diverge.
Right.
So Schuon starts by giving us a couple of different ways to understand faith. So he describes faith as, you know, almost a pre-knowledge, kind of intuitive leaning towards transcendent truths.
Okay.
So it's almost like having a hunch.
A hunch, sure.
Or a deep-seated feeling about something before you fully understand it rationally.
Yeah.
But then he also defines it as the very lifeblood of knowledge itself.
Yeah.
Where a profound intellectual certainty permeates your whole being.
Right. So there's this...
Not blind faith, right?
No. But it's almost like a kind of knowing.
An intuition.
Yeah, an intuition that leads to this deeper understanding.
A knowing that leads to love.
Yeah.
As the Gospels say, you know, love God with all your strength.
Right. Right. And then he brings up this really interesting point about, how we judge ourselves and others.
Right.
He says that, while our intelligence can give us a rough idea
of whether our actions are good or bad.
Yeah.
Generally we can't make a definitive judgment according to God's standards.
Right, because those are ultimately beyond our grasp.
Yeah, it's like we don't have the full picture.
Yeah.
So it kind of takes the pressure off our limited human assessments.
It does, in a way,
Yeah. And then he draws this fascinating parallel between Luther's emphasis on, faith alone for salvation and the teachings of Shinran.
Yeah.
A key figure in Japanese Pure Land Buddhism.
Right, Pure Land Buddhism.
Yeah. And Shinran emphasized absolute faith in the other power of Amida Buddha, contrasting it with reliance on self-power through one's own spiritual practices.
Right, so it's this idea of, complete surrender to a higher power.
Yeah, grace, right.
Yeah, grace.
Yeah. And both of these, Luther and Shinran, they highlight this primary reliance on something beyond
ourselves.
Yeah, beyond our individual effort for spiritual liberation.
Right, and this leads us to, I guess, a seemingly contradictory idea within the New Testament itself.
Yeah.
The famous passage in 1 Corinthians that emphasizes the supreme importance of love.
Right. Like love is the greatest.
Right. Love is the greatest.
God is love.
God is love.
Yeah.
And then you have Paul's letters.
Right, especially Romans. Yeah.
Which really stresses this idea of justification by faith.
Right. So how do we reconcile these?
Yeah. And Schuon suggests that while love is ultimately the highest virtue, faith has a practical priority in our earthly lives.
Okay.
He even quotes Luther as saying that love in its perfect form is often too immense for us to achieve fully on our own, except through Christ and the faith that he inspires.
Right. So
in a sense, love becomes attainable indirectly through faith.
Right.
And the exception he notes is this kind of natural human charity we show to our neighbors, which flows more directly from our shared humanity.
Right. That's kind of just natural.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so this brings us to Schuon's way of characterizing Christianity as a specific kind of spiritual path, a bhakti yoga. A path of devotion. But one rooted in a Semitic context and emphasizing sacrifice.
Right.
He sees it as a tradition destined to become a world religion.
Right, a global religion.
Yeah. And its very unique nature, he says, provoked a response from the Semitic world, which he identifies as the emergence of Islam.
The emergence of Islam,
Yeah. He argues that, the central Christic event, the redemption through Christ's sacrifice, this demands a sense of absoluteness and uniqueness. And this is why you have these doctrines like the virgin birth and the raising of the dead.
Things
that point to this this unique event. However, because it's a specific historical event, it's inherently limited in time and space.
Right, in time and space.
Which, suggests that it's not the only way.
Not the only way to understand ultimate truth.
Right, and for Schuon, the defining characteristic of Christianity, its Magna Carta, if you will, is this unparalleled superhuman nature of Christ.
Right.
And this is essential for a personalist bhakti path.
A devotional practice centered on a personal God.
Yeah.
Because it requires a supreme and irreplaceable object of love in human form.
Right. So it needs that focal point.
That focal point,
Yeah. And he interprets the Trinity not as some kind of abstract philosophical puzzle, but as a Christification of God.
Right.
It's an emphasis on, how the divine manifests in the world. Particularly through Christ.
Through Christ,
rather than just, a purely metaphysical definition of God's ultimate essence.
Right. So it's more about relationship.
Yeah. It's about
than it is about abstract concepts.
Right. That personal connection.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so the Christian upaya,
right.
It's, particular method.
Yeah, it's specific way.
Yeah, it's specific way. It's technique, if you will.
Yeah.
Is characterized by this sacrificial love.
Right, by this kenosis.
Yeah. Yeah. And Schuon sees, the entire Christian message as a truth expressed through this lens of bhakti.
Right.
Not as the totality of absolute truth itself.
Right.
And this helps explain, the new law of love in Christianity compared to
the more comprehensive legal framework.
Yeah, the Mosaic.
Yeah, the Mosaic law. Yeah. So it's this particular focus of bhakti versus a broader ethical code.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then Christian esotericism.
Yeah.
It's its inner mystical dimension.
And its inner dimension.
Yeah. Is founded, according to Schuon, on the immanent Christ.
The immanent Christ, yeah.
So the divine intellect or heart.
Right, that dwells within us as light and love.
Yeah, that dwells within us.
Yeah.
And this is ultimately identified
with our true self.
With our true self, yeah.
Yeah. And the Virgin Mary,
in this deeper understanding, embodies a wisdom that's even beyond specific forms and doctrines.
Right, a supraformal wisdom.
Yeah.
That is, in a sense, greater than her son, who represents a particular revelation.
Right, within a specific form.
Within a specific form, yeah.
Yes.
So Christic gnosis, then, is a way of approaching the essence of God through these manifestations of the divine.
Right.
With union achieved by entering into this manifested reality.
Right. So it's not...
It's not just about...
abstract ideas.
It's about...
embracing.
Yeah, embracing...
reality.
Yeah, the reality of the manifestation.
The manifestation.
Yeah. Okay, so then Schuon kind of delves into some of these tensions and seemingly contradictory aspects of these different viewpoints. One key paradox he points out is the historical suspicion.
That exoteric or mainstream religious authorities often had towards Gnosticism.
Gnosticism.